Speaking as someone who drinks vast quantities of coffee and therefore stays up way too late, I actually don't mind the long nights. I'm not actually going to move to Alaska or Norway anytime soon, but early sunset doesn't really bother me. This year, though, the darkening days seem both poetic and ominous, as if the erosion of familiar democratic landmarks is somehow manifesting as encroaching twilight. Not that I recommend doing this, but if you are reading the news, every threatened executive order, every insane political appointment, every proposed policy, every pointedly clueless official statement makes it feel like the shadows are just stretching longer and longer. It's tempting to say that this too shall pass, that everything is cyclic, that everything dies and is reborn, that spring follows winter as surely as dawn follows night. It's not true, is it? Spring returns by celestial certainty, a function of Earth's tilt and orbital dance. Democracy, justice, compassion, these are different. These return only if we bring them back. We're not the first to watch the light fade, of course, just as we are not the first to fear those that fear diversity, that legislate simple answers to complex questions, that demand conformity over truth. The ancient Christians experienced that firsthand. Now, when you think of early Christianity, you might imagine a single, unified faith spreading outward from the center of Jerusalem. That is the official story, after all. But as historian Bart Ehrman describes in his 2005 book, Lost Christianities, the battles for scriptures and faiths we never knew, turns out the reality is very much at odds with the official story. Instead of one true way of being Christian, there were dozens, each offering unique insights into what hope, liberation, and salvation might mean. Take the Ebionites, a word that means the poor ones in ancient Hebrew. These were Jews who followed Jesus but remained Jewish. They followed the 613 commandments they found in the Hebrew Bible, and to them they added the Beatitudes they found in the Gospel of Matthew. The result was a Jewish faith that celebrated vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol, and they took vows of poverty. When faced with suspicion by their neighbors and the state, they came together in intentional communities grounded in solidarity in order to live out their faith in defiance of what society at large expected of them. Then there were the Marcionites, who saw in sacrificial love of Jesus a reason to challenge tradition and the very definitions of God and love. They rejected both the gods of Rome and the God of the Hebrew Bible. A bold move, but also a popular one. The Marcionites were, for almost 200 years, the fastest growing Christian sect. Rejecting everything they rejected everything except the Gospel of Luke. They were pacifists, celibates, and anti-materialists. They promoted fairness, gender equality, the search for truth. And they had a remarkable public allergy to institutional dogma. In their pursuit of righteous and right living, they questioned everything, especially the nature of authority, challenging whether any power that aligns with empire can truly represent good or God. And then there were the many Gnostic communities who saw in Jesus not a loving sacrifice to cure human sinfulness, but instead a grand revealer of divine wisdom. What wisdom? Gospel wisdom. Lots of gospel wisdom. Unlike the Ebionites or the Marcionites, the Gnostics collected gospel narratives like it was Black Friday clearance at Barnes & Noble. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but also the gospel of truth. That gospel taught that ignorance, not sin, was humanity's fundamental problem. And then there was the gospel of Philip, where it was suggested that salvation and liberation came through understanding, not faith or obedience. After these last few weeks, these teachings may seem especially compelling. And there's more. It may surprise you that women played crucial roles in all of these communities. These early Christians cheerfully and unapologetically rejected conservative visions of patriarchal power. So take that, trad wives. But empire, whether Roman then or corporate now, empire tends to take a rather dim view of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Empire reacts poorly to communities that question rather than conform, that seek truth rather than accept an official story. Empire responds to challenges to its authority. And the way the Romans approached ancient Christianity may sound familiar. Many of you know that Emperor Constantine saw religion as a way to unite the factions of a fractioning empire. And that's why he legalized the practice of Christianity. But he did not legalize all of Christianity. Let's see if this comes back. He did not legalize all of Christianity, only some. It was a delicate thing for him. He needed something other than the horde of happy debate squads that were the early church. But he also knew he couldn't just redefine a couple hundred years of cultic practice by waving his hand. What he did instead was clever, methodical, and Machiavellian 1,000 years before Machiavelli. Constantine knew that wealth meant influence. Influence meant growth. The promise of wealth and influence and growth would generate control. Therefore, the carrot, bags of gold, went to certain friendly churches and certain flexible leaders, and not others. On the other hand, he required the church develop a stick, doctrine, dogma, orthodoxy. At this point in Christian history, it suddenly mattered a great deal what individual Christians said and did and believed, because suddenly getting it wrong meant punishment both here and in the hereafter. And that is how the rich tapestry of early Christianity was pruned back to a single thread. But here's the thing. Some of these dissenting voices survived. The 1945 discovery of the ancient texts of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt This was a revelation for scholars and theologians, but it wasn't just an ancient book collection. It was evidence and testimony of people under threat who buried the evidence of their descent out in the desert. We don't know exactly why they did this. Was it resistance? Survival? Pure spite? No idea. What we do know is this. Even though the price for disobedience was high, these ancient dissenters valued these voices enough to preserve them. When communities face threats, whether from Roman legions or modern culture wars, whether from imperial edicts or book bans, whether from theological orthodoxy or enforced patriotism, the simple act of keeping alternative voices alive becomes dangerously profound. Different times, similar pattern. Today, those with power try to replace the complex with the simple, the question with the certain, the diverse with the uniform. In the face of that pressure, preservation is resistance. Now, the ancients couldn't have known if their wisdom would ever see light again. They couldn't predict the future. But I like to imagine that they tried to preserve something for it. In the end, they couldn't prevent the coming of darkness. But it looks like they tried to save what mattered. It's a little thing, but it's an interesting thing. It's an example. And it's not the only one we have. I'll come back to this. Modern authoritarianism relies on our exhaustion, our isolation, our retreat into private spaces where preservation and perseverance feels impossible. But if the rise of tyranny is like the approach of winter, slow, inexorable, and maybe even inevitable, then maybe what winter teaches us is a possible way to respond. Because what winter teaches us is that it's not enough to hope for the light to return. Survival requires preparation. Survival requires action. The key this Advent season might be what theologian Miguel de la Torre calls moving out of hope into what he calls hopelessness. And yeah, you heard me right, hopelessness. And no, he's not talking about giving up or giving in to despair. Instead, he's inviting some clarity. Much like the idea of gratitude that we explored last week, de la Torre suggests that hope, at least as most modern Americans use that word, can and too often does become an excuse for inaction. That the habit of far too many people is to hold to hope as the assurance that someone else will do our work for us. Well, you haven't heard that from me here at UUSG. I'm guessing you may have heard something like it at another church somewhere in your church history. Something like, hold to hope. Let go and let God. Let Jesus take the wheel, hallelujah. And the problem is this. If there is a God who will swoop in and just fix everything, anyway, why should anyone risk anything? And de la Torre says that this is exactly how oppression grows and thrives, through the paralysis that is hope. Instead, de la Torre calls us to learn from communities who have never had the luxury of this kind of hope, who have faced systemic oppression not with passive optimism, but with clear-eyed persistence. These communities don't act because they're certain of success. They act because integrity demands it. Hope, hopelessness. While I might quibble about which word I like best, the point is that in dark times, If our Advent call doesn't generate more than just thoughts and prayers, it's poison. Integrity demands more. So what can we do? While burying books in the desert for 1,000 years is not exactly nothing, I want to say today maybe we can do more. So I have a few suggestions for you, pulled from Timothy Snyder's little book on tyranny. Anybody seen this book? Little book? On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, Timothy Snyder. If you've not seen it or read it, I commend it to you. There's about a dozen copies in the far side of the common room. You're welcome to just grab one of these. Feel free to check that out now or later. As the title suggests, Snyder has 20 lessons, but today I want to lift up 4 spiritual practices for those hoping to face rising tyranny. First, and probably most important for all of us today, do not obey in advance. It's too soon to give up on the future. Too soon for cynicism, too soon for pessimism, too soon for despair, too soon for certainty. It's too soon to hide your opinions, take down your flags, remove your bumper stickers, hide, and try not to be noticed. Instead, keep expressing yourself. Follow your morals, your professional standards, and keep trying to live into your ideals. Do not disappear yourself. Second, defend truth. Tyranny rises when we accept simple lies over complexity. Support and continue to support fact-based journalism. Maintain and share reliable news sources, and resist the comforting pull of oversimplification, reductionism, and false binaries. Claims to absolute truth are almost always attempts to squash dissent, diverse voices, and the pluralism that we Unitarian Universalists hold dear. When they claim certainty, we must say, there is more to this story. And then we must go out and find out what that more is and share it. Third, stand out. Tyranny relies on conformity and isolation. Statements that start with everyone thinks, everyone says, everyone is okay with, everyone wants. These should all make your spidey senses tingle. We know now that false, outrageous, and bigoted statements, if repeated enough, become gospel. So dissent and do it publicly. One person is all it takes to break the illusion of universal agreement. Of us, this will require a little bravery. It means speaking up in public spaces. It means not going along to get along. It means occupying and defending spaces where diverse voices gather. And remember, the social media algorithm is designed for engagement, not truth. Social media is noisy and offensive, for sure. But if all good people simply abandon the digital square, all that's left are the lunatics, amplifying each other, convincing each other that everyone agrees with their lunacy. Don't retreat into echo chambers. Fourth and last for now, practice corporeal politics. Corporeal, right? Your body, your physical body. Digital outrage is very easy to manufacture, but the fact is this: it is very much harder to hate someone to their face. So put your face near other faces, even if you're an introvert. Show up in person. We need to be not only in the public square, but showing up for the local institutions of democracy, like city councils, library and school board meetings, and creating coalitions among those refusing to be marginalized, manipulated, and isolated. This is where and why community is so important. If you know your neighbors, loving them is a whole lot easier. My friends, this is what the practice of hope looks like in dark times. This is where we can start. Know that there is more. Together as a church, our faith has always called us not to be comfortable chaplains to the status quo, but challenging witnesses to a larger truth. As a congregation today, this means several things. One, we must be what Snyder calls an institution of civil society. Not just a place where like-minded people gather, but an organized force for democratic values. It means maintaining our commitments to free inquiry, to diversity of thought, to ethical action, even and especially when those values are under pressure. Two, we must be what De La Torre calls a community of resistance. This means moving beyond comfortable charity into active solidarity. It means using our institutional resources, not just our money, but our building, our networks, our physical presence to protect and advocate for vulnerable communities, to support targeted groups, to maintain space for democratic discourse. And three, we must be at least what those early Christian communities were. Carriers of dangerous memory. When official narratives try to simplify history, we must maintain its complexity. When power demands forgetting, we must practice remembering. When orthodoxy demands conformity, we must be diversity. The good news today is that unlike these early Christian communities, we have something they don't have. We have their stories. We know how diversity was lost, how orthodoxy triumphed, how a wild and growing library of imagination and possibility was deliberately and systematically edited, erased, and forgotten. We know that story now, and we know other stories. One of the great many things that separates today from yesterday, that makes today different from 1920s Germany, is that we have that story too. We know how it started. We know how it went. And we know how it ended. And that is why we can write a different story. We know we must write a different story. We have what they didn't have, the benefit of hindsight and the power of example. We may not be able to reverse recent decisions, apocalyptically stupid as they may be, but we can resist them in ways our ancestors did not and could not. And so that's what we're going to do. As we turn to the close, let me tell you what I believe about darkness and light. I believe the darkness of December teaches us what the darkness of authoritarianism cannot comprehend. That light isn't diminished by being shared. That's the fundamental error of orthodoxy, of authoritarianism, of all systems that try to control and contain. They think light is a finite thing, something that can be hoarded, controlled and rationed out by those who hold power. But you and I, we know different. We know that light multiplies when it's shared. We know that truth grows stronger when it's tested. We know that hope becomes practical and powerful when it's practiced together. The darkness is gathering, but we are gathering too. And when we gather, when we stand together, when we share our light, when we speak the truth, when we rise for each other, this is how we become who we are called to be. Together, we are the light we have been waiting for. Together, we are the hope we have been seeking. Together, we are the dawn that is breaking. This is Advent. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.